She pressed her palms flat against her own throat, the way a drowning woman grabs for rope, not to call for help because she had no voice left in this world, but because the roaring outside the cabin walls was getting closer, and she could not make a single sound to warn him. He was already out there in the dark, bleeding, fighting something she could hear but not see, and all she could do was shake. If you've never found your channel yet, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Nora Voss had not spoken a single word in 4 years, 2 months and 11 days. She had counted every one of them. Not out of grief, though grief had been there at the beginning, sitting heavy in her chest like riverstone. She counted them the way a person counts the bars of a cage, not because knowing the number changes anything, but because it gives the mind something to hold on to when everything else has been taken away. The doctor in Cheyenne had called it trauma-induced mutism. He'd said it the way men said most things they didn't understand, with authority and no warmth, writing on his notepad, while she sat in the chair across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her throat sealed shut, like a wound that had healed wrong. He told her father she might recover with rest and patience. He told her father this as though she weren't sitting 3 feet away, as though she had already become a piece of furniture. A problem to be managed. Her father had nodded, thanked the doctor, paid the fee, and driven her home in silence. He stopped speaking to her much after that, not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. He was a man built for simple things: crops, cattle season, and soil. A daughter who could not answer him back had broken something in his understanding of the world, and he didn't know how to fix it, so he stopped trying. She had understood. She had forgiven him for it long before he asked. But she had not stopped counting the days. Now it was the 21st of July, 1879, and Nora Voss was 24 years old, and she was completely alone on a mountain trail in southern Colorado with a busted wagon wheel and 3 hours of daylight left, and no way in this world to call out for help, even if she saw someone coming. The mule, a gray-faced, stubborn old animal she had borrowed from her neighbor Hattie Marsh, had started limping 2 miles back. The wheel had gone at the bottom of a rocky slope, one spoke snapping clean with a crack that Nora had felt through the soles of her boots. She'd tried to fix it the way her father had shown her. She had the tools. She had the patience. She did not have the strength in her left hand to hold the rim steady while driving the pin, and after 40 minutes in the August heat with sweat dripping into her eyes and her bad hand shaking, she had sat down on the running board and pressed her forehead to her knees and breathed. Just breathed. The paper in her coat pocket said she was traveling to visit a missionary settlement 2 days' ride east to help with the women's sewing school there. That was the truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Nora Voss was leaving Holt Creek and not coming back. Not because anyone had told her to go, because she had finally, quietly, without ceremony or announcement, decided that a life spent being invisible in a place that had decided she was broken was not a life she was willing to keep living. She had $40 sewn into the lining of her boot. She had a small Bible her mother had left her. She had a cloth bag with 4 days of food, a change of dress, a tin of salve, and a letter of introduction from the minister in Holt Creek that described her as a reliable and diligent worker, and made no mention of her voice, because the minister had thought this was kindness. She had no rifle. That she realized now, sitting on the broken wagon in gathering heat with the sound of wind moving through the pines above her and something large crashing through undergrowth somewhere to her left that had been her worst mistake. The crashing stopped. The mule went absolutely still. Nora knew enough about animals to understand what that stillness meant. Hattie's mule was old and bad-tempered and afraid of almost nothing. When it stopped moving and stood with every muscle locked and its ears pinned flat, that meant the thing in the trees was not a deer. She stood up slowly. Her heart was going fast and hard against her ribs. She looked at the tree line. The pines were thick and the shadows were deep, and nothing moved now, nothing she could see. But the smell came through musky and wild and wrong, and the back of her neck went cold despite the heat. Bear. She had grown up in these mountains. She knew the smell. She knew that the worst thing she could do was run, and she knew that the second worst thing was stand in the open beside a panicked mule. And she knew that she had nothing in her hands and no voice to shout, and no weapon and nowhere to go except the trail. She looked up the trail, the direction she'd been heading. Around the bend, maybe a quarter-mile up the slope, she had passed a structure. A cabin. She'd barely noticed it. Old dark log walls, smoke-stained chimney, a corral off to the side, with 3 horses standing quiet in the sun. She hadn't seen anyone outside, hadn't thought about it. She thought about it now. She grabbed her cloth bag from the wagon seat. She didn't run. She walked fast, controlled the way you moved when something was watching you, and you did not want it to understand that you were afraid. The mule made a low, miserable sound behind her, and she kept walking and did not look back. The quarter-mile felt like 5 miles. She came around the bend, and the cabin was there, closer than she remembered, thank God. And she walked up the dirt path toward the door and raised her hand to knock, and only then noticed that the door was already open. Not open the way a door was left open on a summer afternoon. Open the way a door swings when someone has just walked through it in a hurry. It was moving slightly, settling on its hinges as though someone had just come out. She turned. He was standing by the corral gate 30 feet away, watching her. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who wore their size like a threat, but tall, the way mountains were tall, matter-of-factly, without apology, as though any other height would have been a miscalculation. He had a dark beard going gray at the jaw, and his shirt was the color of dried clay, and his hat was pushed back on his head in the way of a man who had been working and hadn't thought to straighten it. He was holding a fence post in one hand and a mallet in the other, and he was looking at her with the kind of expression that gave nothing away, not suspicion, not welcome, not alarm. Just a flat, careful attention, the way a man looked at something unexpected that might or might not be a problem. He did not speak first. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small notepad she carried everywhere. She wrote fast, the pencil moving in short, hard strokes. "Bear on the lower trail. My wagon wheel broke. I'm sorry to trouble you." She held the pad up toward him. He read it. She watched his eyes move across the words. He set the fence post against the corral rail and crossed the distance between them in about 10 seconds with the long, unhurried stride of a man who covered ground for a living. He read it again from closer. Then he looked out past her down the trail, and something shifted in his face. Still not readable exactly, but different, more focused. "How far back?" he said. His voice was low and flat and carried no extra weight to it like most things about him. She held up one finger, pointed down the trail. "Quarter-mile." She nodded. He looked at the tree line and his jaw tightened slightly. "You see it or smell it?" She touched her nose. He nodded once as though this confirmed something. "Come inside." He said it the way he'd said everything else, without inflection, without warmth, but also without any of the hesitation she was used to from people who saw the notepad and started treating her like a problem. He just said it and turned back toward the cabin and went inside, leaving the door open behind him, and after a moment she followed. His name was Ethan Cross. She learned this from a receipt nailed to the wall near the window, a receipt from a feed store in Ridgeline, Colorado, made out to E. Cross for 200 pounds of oats. The date was 3 weeks ago. The cabin was not a rough man's camp. The floor was swept. The tools were hung on pegs. The tin cups were stacked clean on the shelf above the wash basin. There was a braided rag rug on the floor near the fireplace that looked like it had been there a long time, and a wooden chair near the window that faced east, and a Bible on the small table beside it, with a ribbon marker and the spine worn soft from use. It was the cabin of a man who lived with intention, who had decided that being alone did not mean living like an animal. Ethan Cross set his mallet on the work table and moved to the gun rack on the far wall, and he lifted down a rifle and checked the load with the easy automatic motion of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Then he lifted a second one, a shotgun older, and held it out toward her. "You know how to use this." She took the notepad. "I was raised on a ranch." He nodded. "Good. Stay inside. Bar the door after I go." She grabbed the notepad again, faster this time. "You're going out there." "That trail's the only way in or out of this valley from the east," he said. "If that bear's spooked enough to come down toward the cabin, I'd rather deal with it on the trail than in my corral at midnight with my horses screaming." She wrote, "It might be gone already. Maybe?" He didn't look like a man who built his plans around maybes. He picked up his hat from the table and put it on and moved toward the door. "Bar it after me." She crossed to the door. She had the shotgun in the crook of her arm, broken open, 2 shells seated. She could feel the weight of it, familiar and grounding. He paused at the threshold. He looked at her once, just once, a brief, assessing look, the kind that took in more than it appeared to, and then he walked out and she barred the door behind him with both hands. She went to the window. She could not see much. The corral, the horses, the slope of the trail going down into the trees. She watched him cross the corral, check on the horses, briefly speaking to them. She could see his mouth moving, though she couldn't hear. And then he went around the far side of the corral and down the slope, and the pines swallowed him. She watched the trees. She breathed. The horses in the corral were restless, moving in tight circles, and she knew that meant the bear was still close, still in the area. She pressed her palm flat to the window glass and counted. She got to 43 before she heard the first sound. It was a crash. Something massive moving through brush at speed, followed by a sound she had heard once before as a child, and had never forgotten. It started low, resonant, almost felt more than heard, and then it rose into something that had no human equivalent. Something ancient. Something that the body understood before the mind did. The horses in the corral exploded into motion, wheeling and crashing against the rails, and Nora took a step back from the window without deciding to. Then silence. Then after a long moment, a single gunshot. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her back to the logs, the shotgun gripped in both hands, and she waited. She counted again. She could not help it. It was the thing her mind did when the world became too big and too loud and too full of things she couldn't control. It counted. Days. Seconds. Heartbeats. She got to 112 before she heard boots on the steps. 3 slow, heavy steps. A pause. Then his voice flat and tired and slightly strained. "It's me. Open up." She unbarred the door. He came in sideways, which she understood immediately because of the blood. His left shoulder, the left side of his shirt soaked through from collar to elbow, dark and heavy. He was holding his right hand against it with pressure. His hat was gone. There was a long diagonal scratch across his left cheek, not deep but bleeding freely. His eyes were clear, which was the most important thing. Clear and present and focused. She stepped back to let him pass. He moved to the table and sat down in the chair there. Not the chair by the window with the Bible. A different one near the work table. And she could see him making the decision to appear less injured than he was, which was a thing men did that she had always found equal parts reassuring and infuriating. "Shoulder," he said. "Claws got me before I could get a clean shot. Bear's dead." She was already moving. She had seen the tin on the shelf that held medical supplies. She had cataloged it when she first came in, the way she cataloged all rooms, now out of habit, developed across 4 years of being unable to ask anyone for anything. Bandaging carbolic needle and thread, folded cloth. She brought the tin to the table, and then the basin and water from the bucket on the washstand. He watched her move without stopping her. She set everything on the table and pointed at his shirt. He looked at her for a moment, then reached up and began unbuttoning it with his right hand. The left arm he kept low, barely moving. She could see the effort it cost him not to let on how much it hurt. She had known men who groaned and carried on at a splinter. She had known others who would set their own broken bones and call it an inconvenience. Ethan Cross was the second kind which she respected, but the wound was worse than he was letting on, and she needed him to stop performing and let her work. She wrote on the notepad, "Stop moving the left arm. Just let it hang." He read it. "I'm fine." She gave him a flat look. She had over 4 years of silence developed a vocabulary of looks that conveyed things more efficiently than most people managed with full sentences. This one said, "I have the carbolic and I am not afraid to use it, so you can cooperate now, or cooperate in 30 seconds when it hurts more." Something changed in his face. Not softness exactly, but a small, brief acknowledgement. He stopped moving the arm. She worked steadily. The wound was in 3 places: a long tear across the top of the shoulder and 2 shorter, deeper punctures lower down. She cleaned them with carbolic, and he did not flinch, which she noted, and filed away. She pulled the edges together with small, careful stitches. Her hands were sure. Her bad left hand, the one she'd hurt 2 winters ago, the one that shook when she was tired, was steady tonight, as it sometimes was when the task was important enough to override the trembling. He didn't say anything while she worked. She appreciated that. When she was done bandaging, she washed her hands in the basin and turned back to him and wrote, "You should have waited. You didn't know what you were walking into." He read it. He reached up and very carefully touched the bandage on his shoulder, testing it, and said, "Yes, I did." She wrote, "A bear." "A bear," he agreed. "That's what I said." She stared at him. "You went out there because of me." She held the notepad toward him. "I'm a stranger. You don't know me." He looked at the words for a moment. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't expected. Not pride, not heroism, not the performance of gallantry. Just a plain, undecorated statement of fact. "Didn't matter," he said. She looked at him. "You were scared," he said. "You needed the trail to be safe. I had the rifle." He shrugged his right shoulder, the good one, slightly. "That's the whole calculation." She stood there with the notepad in her hand and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was in it. Something older than gratitude. Something that lived in the part of her that had spent 4 years being managed and accommodated and spoken around, and had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated as a person whose safety was worth something without asking anything in return. She sat down in the other chair at the table. She wrote, "My name is Nora Voss. I lost my voice 4 years ago. I'm not slow, and I'm not fragile, and I'm not going to be a burden to you." He read it carefully. All of it. Then he said, "Ethan Cross. I figured most of that already." A pause. The burden part especially. She couldn't tell if that was almost a compliment or almost a joke or both. She wrote, "My wagon is broken on the lower trail. I have money. I'll pay for the wheel repair, and I'll move on in the morning." "Wheel'll have to wait," he said. "There's a dead bear on the trail, and I need to deal with it before dark, or it'll draw every scavenger in this valley down by morning." He stood slowly, favoring the left side. "There's a second room, small, cot in there. You'll sleep there tonight." It was not a question. It was not quite an order either. It was the way he said everything she was starting to understand. Matter of fact. The way a person spoke when they had spent enough time alone that they'd lost the habit of softening things for an audience. She wrote, "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. He picked up his hat from the floor. She hadn't seen it fall in, and went back out. She sat at the table in his cabin with the shotgun across her knees and the notepad in her hand, and listened to the summer evening settle around the mountains. Crickets somewhere below. The horses calming in the corral. Wind moving high up in the pines like breathing. She thought about the way he had said, "Didn't matter," when she'd noted that she was a stranger. She thought about the 4 years of days she had counted. She thought that maybe not. Certainly not even probably, but maybe this one had been worth counting toward something instead of away from it. Outside in the last of the fading light, she could hear him working. Methodical. Unhurried. Taking care of the thing that needed to be done. She did not know yet what Ethan Cross was carrying. She did not know about the brother who had died in a mine collapse 7 years ago while Ethan had been 3 miles away. Or about the woman in Ridgeline who had waited for him through 2 hard winters and then stopped waiting. Or about the deed to this land and the man in the valley below who wanted it and the lengths that man had already gone to in order to get it. She did not know any of that yet. But she knew the cabin was clean and the tools were hung on their pegs. And the Bible by the window had been read until its spine went soft, and she knew that he had walked into the dark with a rifle because she was scared, and she needed the trail to be safe, and he had the rifle. She pulled the cloth bag into her lap and opened it, and took out the Bible her mother had left her. She set it on the table next to his. 2 Bibles. 2 strangers. 1 mountain. 1 summer evening bleeding slowly into dark. She didn't know yet that the man who wanted Ethan's land had already sent someone up the trail to find out who was living on it and what it would take to make them leave. She didn't know that the broken wagon wheel on the lower trail would not be an accident for much longer. She didn't know that in 3 days, Silas Greer's men would come up this mountain with papers that were not legal and a story that was not true, and that when they did, she would be the only one who knew the whole truth and had no way to speak it. She opened her mother's Bible to a page she had read 100 times. The words blurred slightly tiredness heat, the long, difficult day settling into her bones. She closed her eyes. Outside, Ethan Cross was working in the last light, taking care of the things that needed to be taken care of. She listened to the sound of it quiet and steady, and absolutely without drama. And for the first time in longer than she could account for, she did not count the seconds as they passed. She just let them go. The next morning came in hard and bright, the kind of summer morning in the Colorado high country that had no patience for slow starts. Nora woke to the sound of Ethan's boots on the floor of the main room, a steady, deliberate sound, moving from the fireplace to the door and back again. And she lay still on the cot for a moment, listening, letting the reality of where she was settle back into her bones. She was not in Holt Creek. She was not in her father's house in the room with the faded blue curtains and the window that stuck in summer. She was in a small back room of a mountain cabin belonging to a man she had met yesterday. A man who had walked into the dark to kill a bear, because she was frightened, and she was still alive, and the bear was dead, and outside the birds were going at it with real conviction. She got up, straightened her dress, pinned her hair, and went into the main room. Ethan was at the fireplace. He'd already started coffee and had bacon going in the iron skillet, and he was doing it all with one hand because the left arm was braced against his side, the bandaged shoulder held still. He didn't turn when she came in. He was watching the skillet the way he watched most things, without expression, without fuss, just watching. She went to the wash basin and cleaned her face and hands, and then she went to his side and pointed at the skillet and then at herself. He looked at her. "I can manage." She pointed again, more firmly. A pause. Then he handed her the fork and stepped back. She cooked. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set them on the table. They ate without speaking, which was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. Most people treated silence with her like a malfunction, filling it with nervous chatter, explaining things she hadn't asked to be explained. Performing normalcy so hard, it exhausted everyone in the room. Ethan Cross treated silence like weather. It was there. He didn't fight it. Halfway through breakfast, she opened her notepad. "How's the shoulder stiff?" he said. "It'll do. You should keep the arm still for 2 days at least. Got fences to finish. The fences can wait 2 days." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Can they?" It wasn't really a question. She let it go for the moment. "I need to get my wagon fixed. Is there someone in the valley I can hire?" He set down the cup. "Nearest man with a proper wheel is down in Ridgeline, Tom Hadley, 2 hours ride." He paused. "But I wouldn't send you down there alone." She wrote, "I'm not asking you to send me anywhere. I'm asking about hiring someone." "I know what you're asking." His voice didn't change. "And I'm telling you that Ridgeline's got some complications right now that make it a bad idea for a woman traveling alone to ride in asking questions and hiring men." She stared at him. "What kind of complications?" He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him making a decision about how much to say. Men did this, calculated what a woman could handle, measured it out like medicine. She kept her face neutral and her eyes level, and eventually he seemed to register that she was waiting, not wilting. "You know the name Silas Greer?" She wrote no. "He owns most of what's down in that valley," Ethan said. "The mill, 2 of the 3 stores, the boarding house. He's been buying up land around the valley for 3 years, and he's not particular about how he goes about it. Some of the old ranchers sold to him willing enough. Others got convinced. And there's at least 2 parcels that changed hands in ways nobody can fully explain with papers that the circuit court is still looking at." He stopped. She wrote, "And your land." He looked at his cup. "My land's not for sale." "Has he tried to buy it?" "3 times." "What happened? I said no 3 times." A pause. "The last man he sent up here to make the offer rode back down with a less comfortable seat than he rode up with." She blinked. Then she understood, and something that wasn't quite a smile moved through her face before she could stop it. He caught it. His expression didn't change, but something in the set of his jaw shifted fractionally. "I'm telling you this so you understand that riding into Ridgeline and hiring one of Greer's men, which is what most of the men in town are at this point, to come up here, would be a bad situation for both of us." She wrote, "So I'm stuck here until the wheel's fixed. Unless you want to go around through the North Pass," he said, "which adds half a day and goes through terrain that's hard on a wagon even with a good wheel." She thought for a moment, then wrote, "Can you fix the wheel yourself?" "Given 2 good arms, yes." She pointed at his shoulder. "I said 2 good arms," he said. "I've got 1.5 right now." "I have 2 good arms. Mostly." She hesitated, then added, "My left hand shakes sometimes, but I'm stronger than I look." He read that twice. Then he looked at her hands, really looked the way he'd done with everything, that flat, careful attention that didn't perform itself. "All right," he said. "After breakfast." They fixed the wheel together, which took most of the morning and involved a great deal of non-verbal negotiation conducted entirely through pointed fingers, exasperated looks, and notepad exchanges that grew shorter and more efficient as the hours went on. Her left hand shook twice when she was holding tension on the rim, and both times Ethan adjusted his grip to compensate without comment, and without making a face about it, which she noted. At one point, he told her to hold a bolt in position while he drove it, and she did, and the bolt went in clean, and he said, "Good," in the same tone he would have used for a well-trained horse, not condescending, just efficient, and she found she didn't mind it. The wheel was done before noon. She brought the mule down from where she'd tied it the night before, and they hitched it to the wagon, and she checked the wheel's stability, rocking the wagon frame, and it held. She turned back toward the cabin to get her bag. Ethan was watching her from the corral gate. He had that look again, the measuring one, the one that didn't hurry. She went in, collected her things, and came back out. She wrote on the notepad and held it toward him. "Thank you. For everything. I'll pay you for the wheel and the lodging." "No charge," he said. "I'd rather pay." "I know you would." He pushed off from the gate. "Keep your money." She looked at him. He said, "The North Pass Road is better than it was last year. I cleared some of the fall timber in the spring. You'll be fine on it if you go steady." She wrote, "Which direction?" He walked her to the edge of the trail and pointed north, telling her the landmarks: a split boulder, a stand of dead aspen, a creek crossing in the same unhurried exact way he did everything. She wrote it all down. He waited while she wrote, which most people didn't do. When he was done, she held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His hand was rough and warm, and he shook firmly the way a person shook another person's hand when they respected them. She climbed up to the wagon seat. She looked back at him once. He had already turned back toward the corral, back toward the fence that needed finishing, back toward his life which had no room in it for a mute woman with a broken wagon and no business being on this mountain. She turned the mule north. She got as far as the split boulder. That was where the 3 riders were waiting. They were stopped in the middle of the trail, their horses standing easy, the way horses stood when they'd been waiting long enough to get bored. 2 of the men she didn't know. The third one, the one in front with the gray vest and the careful way he held himself, the way of a man who had learned that stillness was more threatening than motion. She didn't know either, but she understood immediately what he was. He was Silas Greer's kind of man. She had seen the type in Holt Creek. Men who wore authority like a coat they'd borrowed and never given back. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, you staying up at the Cross place?" She reached for her notepad. She held it up, pointing to her throat. He frowned. "Beg pardon." She wrote quickly. I don't speak. I'm passing through. He read it slowly. Behind him, one of the other riders said something low, and the third one laughed. Well now, the man in front said. He had a smooth voice, the kind that had practiced being reasonable. That's interesting, because we had a report that there was a woman up at Cross's cabin, and Mr. Greer likes to know about travelers moving through his valley. She wrote, This is not Mr. Greer's valley. The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Well, that's a matter of some debate, isn't it, ma'am? Question is, what a lone woman's doing up at Ethan Cross's place overnight. He let that sit for a moment, the way men like him always let things sit, leaving the ugliness in it for you to step in yourself. Mr. Greer's a generous man. He's interested in making sure any travelers in the area are comfortable. She wrote, I'm leaving. Please move. Sure? He said pleasantly. Sure, we'll move. We'd just like to know your name and where you're headed for Mr. Greer's records. She stared at him. For his records. That's right. She looked at the three riders. She looked at the trail behind them, then at the trail behind her. She thought about Ethan Cross 2 miles back, one good arm finishing fences. She wrote a name. Not her name. She wrote Clara Webb Missionary Settlement east of the ridge and showed it to the man, and then put her notepad away with a finality she hoped communicated everything she was not able to say out loud. He read it. He glanced at the other riders. Then, after a pause, she felt in her back teeth he moved his horse to the side of the trail. Well, Clara, he said pleasantly, you have a safe journey. She drove the mule through the gap between them without looking at any of them. She felt their eyes on her back for a long time. Her hands were shaking, both of them, not just the bad one when she made the next bend and they were out of sight. She pulled the mule to a stop and sat on the wagon seat and breathed. In and out, measured, controlled. The way she'd learned to do when the silence inside her became too large and the world outside became too loud. 3 men, waiting on the trail from Ethan's cabin. That was not a coincidence. She thought about what he'd told her. The land, the 3 refusals, the man he'd sent back down the mountain with a less comfortable ride than he'd arrived with. She thought about the papers Ethan had. She'd seen a deed tacked to the wall inside the cabin above the receipt from the feed store. She hadn't looked closely. She wished now that she had. She sat there for 2 full minutes. Then she turned the mule around. She told herself it was because she'd left her mother's Bible on the table. That was true, she had. She'd picked up her bag and her notepad and walked out and left the Bible sitting on the table next to his. But that was not the whole truth, and she knew it. She drove back. Ethan was at the far corner of the corral when she came back around the bend, driving a post with the mallet in his right hand, his left arm still held low. He turned when he heard the wagon, and the look on his face was hard to read, but she thought she saw something move through it. Fast, controlled, gone before it could be identified. She climbed down from the wagon and went to him and opened her notepad. 3 men on the North Trail. Gray vest, 2 others. They asked who I was, where I was headed, and who I'd been staying with. He read it. His face went still in a different way than usual, not the neutral blankness he wore as a default, but something with more edge to it. What'd you tell them? A false name, missionary worker. A pause, then she added. They weren't asking casually. He looked out at the trail in the direction of the North Pass. He was quiet long enough that she wrote again. You knew they might be there. I suspected it. His jaw worked slightly. I sent you north because I thought they might have the main trail covered, not the North Pass. I was wrong. She stared at him. You sent me north because you thought the main trail was covered. She held the pad up close enough that he'd have to look away to avoid it. You knew there might be men on the trail, and you didn't tell me. I wasn't sure. That's not good enough. He looked at her. Something in him shifted, not a lot, not dramatically, but she caught it. The faint alteration of a man who had been operating on assumptions and has just been shown that one of them was wrong. No, he said. It isn't. A beat. I'm sorry. She hadn't expected the apology. She stood with the notepad and stared at him. He said, It's my problem. I've been dealing with Greer's men alone long enough that I stopped thinking about how my decisions affect other people on the trail. A pause. You weren't supposed to be in the middle of this. She wrote, Well, I am. Yes. So tell me all of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and said, Come inside. This time at the table he told her everything. It took a while. She asked questions on the notepad and he answered them, and she could tell it was not something he was used to. Not the talking exactly, but the being asked, the having someone sit across from him and want to understand, rather than just be told what to do about it. The land had been his father's. His father had homesteaded it in 1861, worked it through drought and a killing winter and 2 failed seasons, and had built something that held. When his father died, the land passed to Ethan. He had the original deed. He had the survey records. Everything was in order, filed correctly with the Territorial Land Office. Silas Greer had produced a second deed. A deed dated 1873, claiming the eastern third of Ethan's parcel had been sold to a land company, Greer's Land Company by Ethan's father, for a sum of $240. Ethan's father had never sold anything. Ethan had been there when his father died. He had gone through every paper in the cabin afterward, every letter, every record. There had been no transaction, no receipt, no mention of any sale. But the deed Greer had produced looked real. The signature looked real. And the county clerk who had authenticated it was a man named Aldous Webb, who had been hired 3 years ago, 2 months before Greer started buying up the valley. She wrote, Has anyone looked at the signature closely? Compared it to documents your father definitely signed? Ethan said, The circuit judge is supposed to come through in September. I've been waiting, keeping myself on this land until then because if I leave for any stretch of time, Greer's men will move in and claim I've abandoned it. He paused. It's a slow squeeze. He's done it before to others. Tire the man out. Isolate him. Make him feel like he's fighting the whole valley at once. She wrote, Is the whole valley against you? Not all of them. The Marshes are good people. Family over on the East Ridge been here longer than Greer. Tom Hadley and Ridgeline the wheelwright. He's honest. There are others. His voice was level, but she could hear the weight under it. But Greer employs enough men and owns enough of the town that most people keep their heads down. They've got families. They can't afford to stand with a man who might lose. She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote, You told me this morning the wheel couldn't be fixed by you alone with one good arm, but you fixed it, with my help. He looked at her. She wrote, I'm making a point. I see that. You've been fighting this alone because you've been assuming you have to fight it alone. Something moved in his face. Not quite resistance, not quite recognition, something between the two. A stranger passing through isn't exactly backup, he said. She wrote, I'm not passing through anymore. A pause. Then she added, Apparently. He looked at the words. He looked at her. You don't have to stay, he said. This isn't your fight. No. She wrote it, then paused, then kept going. But 3 men stopped me on a trail to find out who I was and whether I'd been here, which means I'm already in it. And I'd rather be in it with the truth than on the road with a false name. He was quiet. She waited. The Bible, he said finally. She blinked. You came back for the Bible, he said, or that's what you're going to say. She looked at him. She picked up the notepad. Don't push it, Mr. Cross. And there it was, the thing she had not been sure he possessed. It was small, just a fraction, just the brief, precise movement of one corner of his mouth. But it was there. He reached across the table and picked up her mother's Bible and set it in front of her. All right, he said. If you're staying, there are some things you need to know. She set down her pen. She listened. He told her about the riders who came through the South Trail every Thursday, Greer's men rotating through, making sure Ethan hadn't done anything with the land. He told her about the water rights dispute that was tied to the land claim, because the creek that ran through the eastern parcel fed 3 other ranchers downstream, and Greer wanted that water the way he wanted everything quietly with paperwork before anyone noticed. He told her about a man named Cord Dillard who was Greer's foreman, and who was the man in the gray vest she had met on the trail. "Dillard doesn't do anything obvious," Ethan said. "He's not that kind of trouble. He's the kind that makes other people make mistakes." How? Pressure. Implication. He shows up somewhere often enough that people start assuming he belongs there. He makes offers that sound reasonable until you look at what you'd be giving up to take them. He tells your neighbors things about you that aren't quite lies, but aren't quite true either. Ethan's voice was flat. He's been telling people in Ridgeline that I'm unstable, that living alone up here too long has made me unreliable, that I'm the kind of man who's a danger to himself and others. She thought about the men who had laughed when she'd held up the notepad. She wrote, "Is that why they laughed? Because you sent me that direction, and they thought, probably." He didn't finish the sentence for her, but she didn't need him to. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear. Something cleaner and harder than fear. She wrote, "I can help. I can read and write well. I can go through documents, compare handwriting, make records." She paused, then kept writing. "People underestimate me because I'm quiet. They say things around me they wouldn't say around someone who might speak back. That's been a disadvantage my whole life. It doesn't have to be." He read it. He read it a second time. "You're saying you'd be useful as someone people overlook," he said. "I'm saying I already am that person. I might as well use it." He looked at her for a long time. "There's risk in this," he said. "Real risk. Greer isn't the kind of man who lets complications sit. I know. You don't know him. I know his kind." She wrote it fast, certain. "I grew up with his kind. Men who decide what a woman is worth and what she's allowed to know, and what she ought to be grateful for. I have been a complication my whole life just by existing. This is the first time being one might accomplish something." Silence. He stood up from the table, walked to the window, looked out at the mountains the way he did when he was deciding something he didn't want to rush. She waited. She was good at waiting. He turned back. "I ride into Ridgeline every 2 weeks for supplies," he said. "Next run is in 5 days. If you want to come, I can introduce you around. Tom Hadley will talk to you straight. There's a woman named Ruth Carlisle who runs the church. She knows where every document in this county got filed and what happened to it. If Greer's deed is forged, she'll help us find proof." She picked up the pen. "And Dillard. If he sees me in town with you, then he sees you," Ethan said. "We haven't done anything wrong. We aren't hiding." She wrote, "He'll make up a story. He'll try." A pause. Let him. The truth doesn't get weaker because someone tells a lie next to it. She looked at that sentence. She thought she would remember it for a long time. She wrote, 5 days is a long time to stay in a stranger's home. "I'll stay on my side of the door," he said. "You stay on yours. We'll work." She almost wrote something sharp back, but stopped herself, because the truth was, he hadn't done or said a single thing in the last 24 hours that required sharpness in return. He had been exactly what he appeared to be, a man who did what needed doing and didn't make noise about it. "I'll need my bag from the wagon," she wrote. "I'll get it." "Your shoulder, it's a bag, Miss Voss, not a wagon wheel." She let him get the bag. The next 5 days settled into a shape she hadn't anticipated. She had expected awkwardness, the grinding discomfort of two people forced into proximity. They hadn't chosen each performing politeness like a job. It wasn't like that. Ethan rose before dawn and was in the corral before she was dressed. She made coffee. He came in when it was ready without being called. He seemed to sense it the way he sensed most things, through some quiet attentiveness that operated below the surface. They ate. They worked. She went through the deed box he kept under the bed, a flat cedar box with a simple latch, and laid everything out on the table and organized it. He had more documentation than she'd expected. His father had been meticulous. Survey records. Correspondence with the Territorial Land Office. 2 letters from a lawyer in Denver, dated 1866, confirming the homestead claim. Original receipts for livestock and fence materials going back to 1862. She cross-referenced everything and made a clean list organized by date, with notes on what each document proved. She wrote it all in her clearest hand. Ethan came in at midday and stood over the table and looked at what she'd done, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know I had all this." "You had it. It was just in pieces." She paused, then wrote, "Pieces are what they're counting on. When evidence is scattered, it looks like chaos. Organized, it tells a story." He looked at her. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My mother kept the ranch accounts. She taught me before she died. I kept them after." A pause. "My father didn't know I did it. He thought the neighbor's son was doing them. He paid the neighbor's son $20 a year, and I did the work." She didn't write anything more after that. Ethan was quiet for a while. "I'm sorry," he said. She shrugged. She wrote, "It's done. This is what matters now." He nodded slowly. He sat down across from her and picked up one of the old letters and read it. She watched him read the careful, unhurried way he did it, moving his lips slightly on the harder words, the way of someone who had taught himself and was proud of what he'd built. "This letter," he said, holding it up. "It refers to a boundary survey, meets and bounds. There's a stone marker the surveyor set at the northeast corner of the parcel in 1861. He set the letter down. Greer's forged deed puts the boundary 50 yards west of that marker, which would mean the marker is on Greer's land, not mine." She looked at the letter. She looked at him. "Is the stone still there?" "It was there 2 years ago when I last checked. If someone removed it, Greer's version of the boundary looks right on paper. If the stone is still there, it contradicts his deed on the ground." "Yes." She wrote, "We should check it." "We will." He folded the letter. "But not today. I want you to see it when we go, and I want to go when it's less likely Dillard's men are watching the east boundary." He paused. "They've been watching the east more than the west lately. I noticed last week." "Why the east?" "Because the stone marker's on the east." His voice was quiet and certain. "He knows it's there. He's deciding what to do about it." She felt the cold precision of it, the patience, the way a man like Greer moved not in a rush, not obviously, but always toward a destination that the people around him only saw when they arrived there and it was too late. She wrote, "He's been planning this for a long time. 3 years at least," Ethan said. "Maybe longer." A pause. "He doesn't make moves he's not sure of, which means he thinks he's sure of this one." "What made him sure?" "Probably the fact that I'm alone up here," Ethan said, "and that most of the town thinks I'm difficult, and that a man who doesn't leave his land can't very well go to the land office or the courthouse or hire a lawyer in Denver." He looked at the table, at the organized papers, at her handwriting covering the list. "He's probably been counting on the fact that even if I had the documentation, it'd never be in a form anybody could use." She looked at her list. She looked at him. She picked up the pen. "He miscounted," she wrote. Ethan Cross looked at those 2 words for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am. I believe he did." Outside, the summer afternoon was pressing down on the mountain with its full weight, and somewhere below she knew Cord Dillard was riding back to Silas Greer with a report about the mute woman with the broken wagon. She knew the story Dillard would tell polished reasonable, with just enough implication buried in it to plant a question where there hadn't been one before. She knew it because she knew how men like that built their cases. Quietly. In pieces. Banking on the idea that the people they were building against were too scattered, too isolated, too small in the world's estimation to put the pieces together in time. But she was here. And she had her mother's handwriting in her blood, and 4 years of silence, making her invisible in every room she entered, and a cedar box full of a dead man's careful records. And she had 5 days before they rode into Ridgeline together. Whatever Dillard was building, she was going to dismantle it from the inside. She put the pen down and reached for the next document. She started reading. The ride into Ridgeline took 2 hours, and Nora spent most of it watching Ethan's back. He rode ahead on a big gray quarter horse named Hatch, moving with the economy of a man who had been on horseback since before he could read. She followed on the mule, which had opinions about the pace, but kept them mostly to itself. The road was dry, and the summer heat was already building by mid-morning, and Nora had her notepad in her coat pocket, and her mother's Bible in her bag, and the organized list of Ethan's documents memorized so thoroughly she could recite it backwards. She had spent 5 days preparing for this. She was ready. What she was not ready for was Ridgeline itself. It was not the town that surprised her. She had grown up near enough to small western towns to know their layout. By instinct, the main street, the general store, the saloon, the livery, the small structures pressing together like people trying to stay warm. Ridgeline looked like all of them. It smelled like all of them. Dust and horse and wood smoke and something frying somewhere. What she was not ready for was the way people looked at Ethan when he rode in. Not with hostility exactly. With the careful sideways attention of people who had been told something about a man and were trying to reconcile it with what they were seeing. A woman on the boardwalk pulled her child slightly closer. 2 men outside the feed store stopped talking and watched. The barber appeared in his doorway and then stepped back inside. Ethan rode through all of it, without changing his posture or his pace. He tied Hatch at the post outside a building with a hand-lettered sign that said Hadley Wheel and Iron Works, and climbed down, favoring his left arm only slightly. The shoulder had been healing. She had changed the dressing 3 times, and the punctures were clean, and the long tear was knitting together properly. He would have a scar. He would probably have 3. He did not seem concerned about this. She tied the mule next to Hatch and climbed down, and they went inside. Tom Hadley was a short, wide man with a red beard, gone mostly white, and hands that looked like they had been carved from something harder than flesh. He looked up when they came in, and his face did something immediate and unguarded. It opened. "Ethan Cross," he said. "You're not dead." "Not yet," Ethan said. "Tom, this is Nora Voss. She doesn't speak. You'll want to let her write." Tom Hadley looked at her with the same open, undefended expression, and she liked him immediately. He said, "Ma'am, any friend of Ethan's is welcome here." She wrote, "Thank you. I've heard you're the honest man in this town." She held the pad up. Tom read it and laughed a real laugh, not a polite one. "Well, I'm one of maybe 4, depending on the week." He looked at Ethan. "You look like you took a hit." "Bear," Ethan said. "Bear," Tom repeated flatly. "It's dead." "I'd hope so. Sit down, both of you. I'll get coffee." Tom's back room was where Nora understood why Ethan trusted him. It was a working room, tools on the walls, iron on the bench, the organized chaos of a man who knew where everything was, even when it didn't look like it. But there was also a shelf of books, and on the desk beneath a piece of clear glass he used as a paperweight, a document she recognized as a land survey from the territorial office. He saw her looking at it. "You know what that is," he said. She wrote survey record, East Quadrant. Tom looked at Ethan. "She's sharp." "Yes," Ethan said. Tom sat down. "It's a copy I got from the land office 3 weeks ago. Cost me 2 days' ride and $1.50. It shows the original boundary of this valley's homestead claims as filed in 1861 and 1862. He leaned forward. "And it does not match the boundary that Silas Greer's deed describes." She wrote, "How far off? 60 yards on the eastern line, maybe more." He pulled out the survey and set it on the table. "Greer's deed puts Crossland 50 yards west of the actual survey boundary, which is either the worst mistake a land company ever made or the most careful lie." "The marker's still there," Ethan said. "I checked it the day before yesterday." "Good," Tom said. "Because if that marker disappears, we've got a problem." Nora wrote quickly. "We need to document the marker's position, photograph it if we can, or have a witness go to it with us and sign a sworn statement about its location." Tom read that and looked at Ethan. "She's not just sharp, she's strategic." "I know," Ethan said. She wrote, "Who can we trust to be a witness?" "Someone whose word the circuit court would respect." "Ruth Carlisle," Tom said immediately. "Minister's wife. Keeps every document in this county organized better than the county clerk does." Greer's been trying to get her husband moved to a different posting for 2 years, which tells you how much he doesn't want her here." He stood. "I'll take you to her." Nora picked up her bag. Ethan said quietly, "Tom." Something in his voice made her pause. Dillard was watching us right in. Tom's expression didn't change. "I know, he's always watching. Don't let it change what you do." "It doesn't," Ethan said. "I just want you to know." Tom nodded. "Noted." They walked to the church. Nora was aware of eyes following them, not just Dillard's, she suspected, though she didn't see him directly. The feeling of being watched was specific and constant, the way it always was when a powerful man in a small town decided you were interesting. She kept her chin level and her hands steady. Ruth Carlyle was a small woman, somewhere in her 60s, with gray hair pinned back severely, and eyes that were the particular bright evaluating color of someone who had spent decades deciding exactly what kind of person they were looking at. She opened the church door before Tom knocked, which suggested she'd been watching the street. "Tom Hadley," she said. "And Ethan Cross. And someone I don't know." Tom said, "This is Nora Voss. She can't speak." Ruth Carlyle looked at Nora steadily for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Can she read?" Nora had her notepad out before Tom could answer. "She wrote faster than most people in this town, I'd wager." Ruth read it. Something shifted in her face, not a smile, something better than a smile. A recognition. "Come in," she said. "All of you." The next hour was the most productive Nora had experienced in longer than she could measure. Ruth Carlyle did not perform patience. She did not wait for people to finish their thoughts and then reframe them. She listened at full speed and responded at full speed, and she did not once treat Nora's notepad as an inconvenience or a novelty. She read what Nora wrote and responded to it and moved on, and the conversation had a rhythm to it that felt almost like the conversations Nora only remembered from before. The document Ruth produced from her locked cabinet in the vestry changed everything. "I have been keeping a record," Ruth said, "of every land transaction in this county for the past 4 years. Not because it was my job, because it needed to be done and no one else was doing it." She set a leather ledger on the table. "The county clerk Aldous Webb, he's Greer's man. Everyone knows it. But knowing it and being able to prove it are 2 different things." She opened the ledger to a marked page. "This is the date that Greer's deed for the eastern parcel of Crossland was supposedly authenticated by Webb. March 14th, 1876. Ethan looked at the page. "And this," Ruth said, turning to another section, "is a letter I received from my sister-in-law in Denver on March 16th, 1876. She mentions that she had dinner with Aldous Webb the week prior, which would have been the week of March 10th through the 14th. The room went quiet. Nora wrote Webb was in Denver when he supposedly authenticated the deed. "That's what this letter says," Ruth said. "I didn't understand its significance until Ethan's trouble with Greer became more public. Once I understood, I made a copy of the letter and filed it separately." She looked at Ethan directly. "Someone authenticated that deed. It wasn't Webb because Webb was 300 miles away, which means either Greer forged Webb's authentication or he has a second man in the county clerk's office who did it." Ethan said, "Who else works in that office?" "A young man named Preston Cole. He's been there for 2 years. He's Greer's nephew by marriage." Nora wrote fast. "That's your angle, not the signature on the deed itself, the authentication. If you can prove Webb wasn't in the county when the deed was authenticated, the entire document is legally void." Ruth looked at her with something that had moved past recognition into something closer to respect. "That is exactly right." Tom said, "We need to get this to the circuit judge. Judge Hale comes through in September," Ethan said. "That's 6 weeks," Tom said. "That's a long time for Greer to work with." "I know," Ruth said carefully. "There's something else." She closed the ledger. 3 days ago, Cord Dillard came to see me. He was polite. He said he'd heard I kept good records, and he thought I might be able to help clarify a question about one of the Valley's property claims. She paused. "He was fishing. He wanted to know what I had." Ethan said, What did you tell him? That I keep records for the church and that church records are private, which is true. Ruth's voice was completely flat. But he knows I have something. He doesn't know what. The room was very quiet. Nora wrote, "He'll come back." "Yes," Ruth said. "He will." Nora wrote, "How long before he finds a reason to?" She paused, then wrote, "Apply pressure." Ruth said, "My husband is up for review by the church board in October. 3 of the 5 board members are Greer's men." She said it calmly, the way a soldier described a position they'd been holding for a long time. "He's already applying pressure. He's just doing it quietly." Ethan said something then that Nora had not heard from him before. His voice changed, dropped lower, went rougher at the edges, the way a man's voice changed when something that had been sitting at a distance suddenly arrived. "I won't let him do that to you, Ruth." Ruth looked at him. "Ethan Cross, I have been in this county for 19 years. Silas Greer has been here for 3. I am not afraid of him." "I know you're not," Ethan said. "I'm still saying it." Something moved across Ruth's face. She turned slightly away toward the window and was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should know something else." She turned back. "Dillard asked me specifically about the woman traveling with you. He knew she couldn't speak. He described her accurately." Her eyes moved to Nora. "He said she was a woman who had fled a situation back east and that you might not know her full history. He was very considerate about it, as though he was worried for you." Nora's hand tightened on the notepad. She wrote, "He's building a story about me." Her writing was harder and faster than usual. "He doesn't know who I am. He's filling in the blank with whatever discredits me before I can be useful." "That is exactly what he's doing," Ruth said. Ethan said, "Nora." She looked at him. "Is there anything at all he could find that would hold up?" He said it directly without softening it the way he said everything. "I'm not asking because I doubt you. I'm asking because I need to know what's coming." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote, "My father's ranch went bankrupt 2 years ago. He sold everything and moved to his brother's place in Nebraska. I didn't go with him. I've been working wherever I could find work with the missionary network, and I've moved often." A pause. "To a man like Dillard that looks like running." "Were you running?" Ethan said. She looked at the table, then at him. "From one life that had stopped fitting me." Another pause. "Not from anything dishonest." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "That's enough for me." Tom said, "It's enough for me too." Ruth said, "The question is whether it's enough for the circuit court if Dillard puts a character witness in front of Judge Hale before we do." That was the question that rode with them out of the church and back up the main street toward the livery where they'd left the animals. Nora was so absorbed in turning it over that she almost didn't notice the man who fell into step beside them. Almost. He appeared from the gap between the barber shop and the land office, and he walked at exactly their pace, not blocking them, not crowding them, just accompanying them, the way a shadow accompanied you when the sun was at the wrong angle. Cord Dillard. Gray vest. Pleasant face. The careful stillness she remembered from the trail. "Mr. Cross," he said. "Miss Voss, I hope your morning's been productive." Ethan kept walking. He did not look at Dillard. "Cord, beautiful morning for it," Dillard said pleasantly. "I was just thinking it's unusual to see you in town, Ethan. You usually let your supplies run pretty low before you make the trip. Must be something particular drawing you in." He glanced at Nora. Or someone. Ethan stopped. He turned. He looked at Dillard with an expression Nora had not seen on his face before. Not anger would have been easier. Something colder and more specific than anger. "Say what you're saying," Ethan said. Dillard spread his hands the gesture of a reasonable man. "I'm just making conversation, Ethan. No need to take offense." He smiled pleasantly. "Mr. Greer asked me to pass along his regards. He said he'd be happy to revisit the arrangement on your eastern parcel anytime you're interested. It's a fair offer, the kind that gets less fair the longer a man waits." Tell Greer I'm not interested. I'll tell him, Dillard said. Though I wonder if you've had a chance to review his deed carefully. There are some figures there that, well, a lawyer in Denver might be able to explain them better than I can. His deed is a forgery, Ethan said. We both know it. Dillard's pleasant expression did not move. That's a serious accusation, Ethan. The kind of accusation that can make a man look unstable, paranoid even. He glanced again at Nora, and this time his gaze stayed a second longer than it needed to. Especially when a man's been alone up on a mountain for a long time and starts seeing enemies in every corner. Nora had the notepad out. She wrote fast and held it up directly in front of Dillard's face, close enough that he had to take a small step back to read it. Mr. Dillard, I have a letter dated March 16, 1876. Placing Aldous Webb in Denver during the week, the deed you're referencing was supposedly authenticated. I also have a complete organized record of the cross-homestead documents going back to 1861, cross-referenced with territorial survey records. And I have a witness prepared to testify before Judge Hale in September. She held it steady. Now, is there anything else you'd like to discuss? The pleasantness left Dillard's face. It didn't leave in a rush. It left the way expensive furniture left a house that was being repossessed carefully, piece by piece, with the full awareness of everyone watching. What remained underneath was not rage. It was something more controlled and more dangerous than rage. It was calculation. He looked at her for a long moment. Mute woman, he said softly, ought to be careful about what she puts in writing. Ethan stepped forward. One step. Just one, and it was enough. He stopped within arm's reach of Dillard and said nothing, and the silence between them had a weight to it that Nora could feel from 2 feet away. Dillard looked at him. He looked back at Nora. He nodded once, the nod of a man filing information away. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. Tom exhaled. Well, he said, that's done it? It was done the moment we rode in, Ethan said. He was looking after Dillard. His voice was level, but his jaw was set in the way Nora had come to understand meant he was working through something. She touched his arm. He looked at her. She wrote, he's going back to Greer, tonight. Whatever they planned before, they'll move it up. Yes, he said. We have 6 weeks until September. I know. 6 weeks is not long enough if they decide to stop being patient. He looked at her writing for a moment. Then he looked up past her back toward the church at the end of the street. No, he said. It isn't. They rode back up the mountain mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones that had come before. The earlier silences had been comfortable settling. This one had edges. It was the silence of 2 people working through the same problem from different angles and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Dillard would move. The question was when and how. They were halfway up the mountain trail when Ethan pulled Hatch to a stop. Nora stopped the mule alongside him. He was looking at the eastern slope. She followed his gaze and at first saw nothing, just the mountain, the trees, the dry summer grass. Then she saw what he was looking at. A line of fresh horse prints in the dirt at the edge of the trail. Not coming down the trail. Crossing it from east to west through the brush. Someone had ridden through here recently. Not on the trail. Cutting across it. She wrote, today. Hour ago, maybe, he said. Maybe 2. She wrote Dillard sent someone ahead. Or they were already up here, he said. Waiting to see what we did in town before deciding the next move. The marker, she wrote. If they're going to the eastern boundary, he was already moving. He turned Hatch off the trail and into the brush following the line of tracks. She followed on the mule, and the mule was unimpressed by the terrain, but moved through it. It took 12 minutes to reach the eastern boundary. The iron survey marker was still there. A square-cut post set in a mound of stone, old and weathered, the stamped numbers still legible on its face. She had read about it in the documents. Seeing it was different. It was solid and real, and had been standing in this spot for 18 years, and it said clearly, and without ambiguity, exactly where the boundary of Ethan's land was. 30 yards from the marker, The fresh horse tracks turned and went back south away from the boundary. "They came to look," Ethan said. "Didn't touch it." "This time," she wrote. "This time," he agreed. She stood next to the marker and looked at it. 18 years of weather and season, and not moving an inch. She thought about the letter in Ruth Carlyle's cabinet, the survey in Tom Hadley's workshop, the organized list on Ethan's table with her handwriting covering the page. She thought about Dillard's face when she held the notepad up in the street. She had seen the calculation happen in real time, the moment he understood that the mute woman was not an unknown variable he could shape before she mattered. She was already a variable that mattered. The story he'd been building about her would need to change, and that meant going back to Greer and explaining that his slow, patient plan had developed a complication he hadn't anticipated. That was good. Complications cost time and changed plans, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes caused mistakes. She took out the notepad. She wrote, "We need to get a sworn statement from a witness who has seen this marker. Today, if possible. Someone who can describe its exact position relative to identifiable landmarks." Ethan read it. "I can get Dan Marsh. He's on the East Ridge 2 miles. He's been my neighbor for 15 years, and he's got no dealings with Greer." Today, she wrote again. He looked at her. He understood. "Today," he said. They rode to the Marsh place. Dan Marsh was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who came out to meet them with the directness of someone accustomed to Ethan's company. He shook Ethan's hand and looked at Nora without any of the hesitation she expected. "You're the woman from the broken wagon," he said. "My wife Hattie mentioned you." She blinked. Then she wrote, "Hattie Marsh is your wife. 31 years, he said. He looked at the mule. "That's her mule." Nora looked at the mule. The mule looked back at her with the expression it always had, long-suffering and mildly annoyed. She had borrowed the mule from a neighbor who was Ethan's neighbor. She had come to this mountain by accident and arrived apparently within the existing network of the only people in this valley who could help them. The world was sometimes stranger than planning. She wrote Mr. Marsh, "We need you to come with us to the eastern boundary and sign a statement confirming the location of the survey marker." Dan read it. He looked at Ethan. "It's come to that." "It's come to that," Ethan said. "All right." Dan went back inside and came out a moment later with his hat on. "Let's go." It took the rest of the afternoon. Dan Marsh walked the boundary with them, described the marker's location in specific and detailed terms that Nora wrote down in her clearest handwriting, and signed the statement at the bottom. She signed as witness. Ethan signed. Dan's wife Hattie, who had come out to see what was happening, signed as a second witness. Hattie Marsh was a small, strong woman who looked at Nora across the signed document and said, "You did all this today. You came into town, talked to Tom and Ruth, and now you're up here getting witness statements." Nora nodded. "And you can't speak a word." She shook her head. Hattie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, most people with 2 working voices don't get half that done in a week." Something moved in Nora's chest. Warm and sudden and harder to hold on to than she expected. She wrote, "Thank you for the mule." Hattie laughed. "You can keep him another few days. He likes you better than he likes me." They rode back to the cabin as the sun began its drop behind the western ridge. The summer light spread out long and gold across the mountain, and the horses moved through it steadily, and Nora rode with the signed statement folded carefully in her bag, and Ruth Carlyle's information, and Tom Hadley's survey copy, and the list of Ethan's documents, and 4 years of silence that had somehow become over the course of a single day, a weapon instead of a wound. She was thinking about September, about Judge Hale, about whether 6 weeks was enough. She was thinking about Dillard's face, the calculation, the shift. She did not see the smoke until they were close enough that it was unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the cabin. Not heavy smoke, not a structure fire. A controlled burn smell contained the specific sharp scent of something small and deliberate, rather than something accidental. Ethan urged Hatch faster, and she pushed the mule to keep pace, and when they came around the last bend, she understood immediately. Someone had been in the cabin. The door was open. The lock was broken, not forced dramatically, but undone precisely the way someone with a tool and patience undid a lock. Inside the cedar box was on the table, open and empty, not ransacked, deliberate. They had taken the original documents, the survey records, the letters from the Denver lawyer, the deed, everything she had organized, everything she had cataloged. Gone. The small fire in the yard was the ashes of nothing important. Some rags, some old paper set burning to be noticed to tell them something without saying it. We were here. We can come back. We took what we needed. Ethan stood in the middle of his cabin with his hands at his sides and said nothing. Nora looked at the empty cedar box. She looked at her bag. At the folded papers inside it, the copies. The list. The signed statement. Ruth's information, Tom's survey. Everything she had taken with her to town because she had learned 4 years ago never to leave her important things unguarded. She reached into the bag and took out the list and set it on the table beside the empty box. Ethan looked at it. He looked at her. She picked up the pen. They took the originals she wrote. They didn't know I'd already copied and organized everything. They didn't know about Ruth's letter. They don't know about Dan's statement. His face was very still. She kept writing. They think they've taken our case. They haven't. They've taken paper. We have the truth, and we have witnesses, and we have 6 weeks. She paused, then wrote the last line clearly and without hesitation. And they just made their first mistake. Ethan looked at those words for a long time. Outside, the summer evening was coming down fast, and the ashes in the yard were cooling to nothing, and somewhere below the mountain, Cord Dillard was riding back to Silas Greer with a box of stolen papers, confident that what he'd taken was the end of the fight. He was wrong. But neither of them knew yet what he was willing to do when he found that out. Ethan fixed the lock that night. He didn't say much while he did it. He worked by lamplight at the door, replacing the broken mechanism with a heavier one he kept in the bottom of his tool chest, and Nora sat at the table and recopied everything: the list, the timeline, the summary of Ruth's letter, the details of Dan Marsh's statement in a second hand, making a duplicate set she could keep separately from the first. She worked until her fingers ached. He finished the lock and tested it twice, and then came and stood at the edge of the table and looked at what she was doing. "You should sleep," he said. She held up one finger. One more page. He sat down across from her and waited. He didn't read. He didn't fidget. He just sat there in the lamplight with his hands on the table and let her work, and she was aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with the documents in front of her. The awareness had been building for days, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, the way water built behind a dam. She kept her eyes on the paper. When she finished the last page, she set down the pen and flexed her hand. He said, "Where will you keep the second set?" She wrote with Ruth. "She has a locked cabinet, and Greer already suspects her, so taking it there changes nothing for her risk and everything for ours." He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning. First thing." He picked up the lamp to carry it toward the back room, his signal that the night was done, and then he stopped. "Nora." She looked at him. "What they did today," he said. His voice was measured, each word placed carefully. "Coming into my home. Taking what was in that box." A pause. "I want you to know that I'm not going to let what happened today be the end of this." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. "I know," she wrote. "I never thought it would be." He looked at those words. Something moved through his face that she didn't try to name. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Mr. Cross." He almost said something. She could see it, the brief gathering of words that didn't arrive. He turned and went to his room, and she heard him set the lamp down, and the light under his door went dark. She sat in the dark kitchen for a moment and listened to the mountains settle around the cabin. Wind high up in the pines. One of the horses shifting in the corral. The new lock on the door solid and silent. She thought about the cedar box empty on the table. She thought about Cord Dillard carrying it down the mountain. She thought about Silas Greer opening it. Then she folded the second set of documents, carefully put them in her bag, and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Ruth Carlyle took the second set without a word of surprise, which confirmed that she had been expecting something like this. She locked it in the cabinet in the vestry, and then she turned around with her hands folded and said, "I sent a letter to Judge Hale's circuit court office in Denver yesterday." Ethan looked at her. About the timeline," Ruth said. "I didn't give specifics. I said there was a land dispute requiring his attention, and that new evidence had come to light that would not be available if he delayed his September ride." She paused. "I also said the evidence included documentation of potential fraud in the county clerk's office, which I knew would get his attention because he's been watching Webb for 2 years already." Nora wrote, "How do you know he's been watching Webb?" "Because Judge Hale's clerk is my cousin," Ruth said with the calm of someone revealing a card they've been holding for the right moment. "She wrote me in April and mentioned it. I've been waiting for the right way to use that information without endangering her position." Tom Hadley, who had come to the church at Ruth's request that morning, said, "Ruth, how long have you been building this?" "Since the first rancher Greer pushed off his land," Ruth said. 18 months. She sat down at the table. "I want you to understand something. Silas Greer has been operating in this valley the way men like him always operate, by making each individual wrong seem too small to fight and too isolated to connect to anything larger. One rancher loses his land, he thinks it's just his problem. Another family signs a bad deed, they think they made a mistake. It takes someone standing outside all those individual stories to see the pattern." She looked at Nora. "What you did with Ethan's documents, organizing them, connecting them, making the pattern visible, that's what needs to happen with all of it." Nora felt the weight of that land on her. She picked up the pen. How many cases? Ruth opened her ledger. 6 families displaced. 3 properties with disputed deeds. 2 water rights claims. And 1 missing survey record from the county office that I happen to have a copy of because I requested it before it disappeared. Silence. Ethan said very quietly, 6 families. 6 that I know of, Ruth said. There may be more I haven't heard about yet. Nora wrote, "This isn't just your land, Ethan. This is the whole valley." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. He said, "I know." "The question," Tom said, "is whether we can get all of this in front of Judge Hale in a form he can act on. Because a circuit judge can initiate a federal investigation if the evidence supports it. He doesn't need the county clerk's cooperation. He doesn't need the sheriff's cooperation. He goes over all of it." Ruth said, "That's correct, which is why Greer will do everything he can between now and September to ensure this never reaches Hale in a usable form. He'll try to discredit the witnesses," Nora wrote. "Ruth, Tom, Dan Marsh. He'll try to discredit me." "He's already started with you," Ruth said. "Dillard was asking about you again yesterday. He's been telling people you were dismissed from a missionary post for dishonesty." She said it without softening it. "It's a lie, but it's the kind of lie that's hard to disprove quickly." Nora set down the pen. She sat with that for a moment, the specific, practiced cruelty of it. Not a dramatic accusation, just a word dropped here and there, a question raised, a story given legs before she could catch up to it. She had no voice to defend herself in real time. She could not stand in the street and say, "That is not true," in a tone that people believed. She could only write it, and writing was slower than whispering, and by the time the truth caught up to the lie, it was already comfortable in its chair. She picked up the pen. "Then we don't try to disprove it in conversation," she wrote. "We make it irrelevant. If the evidence we bring to Judge Hale is strong enough, my character doesn't matter." Ruth looked at her. "That's the right approach. It's also the harder one." "I know," Nora wrote. "I'm familiar with the harder approach." Tom said, "There's another problem." He looked at Ethan. "The Thursday riders. Greer's men who come through your South Trail every week. I've been thinking about them. They're not just watching. They're establishing presence. If this goes to a federal hearing, Greer's going to claim that Cross abandoned the eastern parcel, that he's not working it, not using it, not maintaining it. Contested land goes to the party that can demonstrate occupancy and use. Ethan said, "I'm there every day." "You're there," Tom said. "But can you prove it formally? Do you have records of work done on the eastern section? Fences maintained, animals grazed, water drawn." Ethan was quiet. Nora wrote, "Start keeping records now. Date, location, work done. Every single day. If you ride the eastern boundary, write it down. If you repair a fence post on the eastern line, write it down." "That's 6 weeks of records," Ethan said. 6 weeks is better than none." He looked at her. "All right." They spent 2 hours at the church table, working through the full scope of what they had and what they needed. Tom produced his copy of the Valley Survey. Ruth pulled 3 more documents from her cabinet statements she had collected quietly from displaced families over the past year. Nora organized everything into a single coherent case file, building the narrative, the way her mother had taught her to build an account book, not as a collection of facts, but as a story, with a beginning and a direction and an ending that the numbers themselves demanded. By the time they rode back up the mountain, it was early afternoon, and the case file was in Ruth's locked cabinet, and a copy was in Nora's bag, and Ethan had a new ledger in his saddlebag to start his daily records. The ride-up was quieter than the mornings had been. Not an uncomfortable quiet. A tired one. The kind that came after productive work when the mind was still turning things over, but the urgency had eased slightly. Halfway up the trail, Ethan said, "My father used to say that a man who fights alone fights half a war." She looked at him. "He meant it different than I used to take it," Ethan said. "I thought he meant you needed other men beside you. People who could throw a punch or fire a rifle. But that wasn't it." He looked ahead up the slope. "He meant what we did today. He meant Ruth and Tom and Dan Marsh and—" He stopped. Didn't finish it. She waited. "I've been up on this mountain for 4 years, he said, telling myself I was protecting what was mine by staying on it. Not letting anyone in. Not asking for help." A pause. "Greer's been building his case for 3 years, and I've been sitting here letting him do it because I thought staying put was the same as fighting back." She took out the notepad. She wrote while the mule walked, which she had gotten good at. Staying put kept the land. That mattered. She held it so he could read it from horseback. "But you're right, that it wasn't enough. It never was." He read it. He nodded once. "Your father was right," she wrote. "And you're listening to him now. That counts for something." He didn't say anything to that. But his shoulders dropped a fraction, the small specific release of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down, even briefly. They were almost to the cabin when she felt it. Not saw it. Felt it, the particular quality of wrongness that the body registered before the mind caught up. The horses felt it too. Hatch broke stride and his ears went flat, and the mule stopped dead in the trail, and she had to push it forward. There was a horse tied to the post outside the cabin. A good horse, dark bay, well-saddled, expensive bridle. Not one of Greer's working horses. Something different. Ethan had his hand near his rifle before she had finished registering the horse. They came in slow. The man sitting on the porch steps was not Cord Dillard. He was younger, mid-30s, in a dark suit that was good quality, but trail-dusty, with round spectacles and the particular tired look of someone who had ridden hard and arrived at a place they weren't sure would be welcoming. He stood when he saw them. He put his hands where they could be seen. "Mr. Cross," he said. "My name is Edmund Vale. I'm a lawyer from Denver. I've been retained by the Territorial Land Office to look into several disputed claims in this county." He looked between Ethan and Nora. "I rode up from Ridgeline this morning. A woman named Ruth Carlyle told me where to find you." Ethan looked at him for a long moment without getting off his horse. "Ruth sent you," he said. "She did. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, that you were the most important case in the valley, and that if I came up here before I talked to anyone else, I'd understand why." He paused. "She also said the mute woman would have everything organized." Ethan looked at Nora. She was already off the mule. She had her bag open. She was pulling out the case file. She walked to Edmund Vale and held out the organized papers, and looked at him over the top of them with the expression that said, "I've been waiting for you. Read fast." Edmund Vale read fast. He stood on the porch steps and went through the entire case file while Ethan unsaddled the horses and Nora made coffee, and neither of them performed patience at him or hurried him. He read the way lawyers read when something surprised them, going back over certain passages, holding 2 pages up next to each other, making small sounds under his breath that weren't quite words. When he came inside, his face had changed. He sat down at the table and set the papers down carefully and said, "This is the most organized evidence file I have seen outside of a Denver courtroom." Nora poured him coffee. She wrote Ruth collected most of the witness material. I organized it. Ruth Carlisle told me you couldn't speak. He looked at her directly. She told me nothing about your history or your credentials. She just said to trust what you'd done with the papers. He looked at the file. She was right. Ethan sat down across from him. What does the Territorial Land Office know about Greer? More than Greer thinks, Vale said. There's been a quiet inquiry running since last spring. Your land isn't the only case, it's the clearest one because you have the original homestead documentation intact, and the discrepancy in the authentication date is provable. He tapped Ruth's letter summary. This, the Denver dinner. If your witness can produce that letter, she can produce it today, Ethan said. Then we have the foundation of a fraud case. Vale looked at both of them. But I need to be direct with you about something. Greer knows the circuit court inquiry is coming. He's known for weeks someone in the Denver office told him, and we don't yet know who. That's why he moved up his timeline. The break-in last night. Ethan went very still. You know about the break-in. Dillard told someone in the Ridgeline Saloon last night that he'd recovered stolen property from a squatter's cabin. Vale said flatly. The man he told happened to be someone I spoke to this morning who didn't like what he was hearing. Squatter's cabin. The words landed in the room like something thrown. Ethan's hand was flat on the table. She could see the tendons in it. She wrote fast. He's reframing the narrative. He's not presenting himself as the one who broke in. He's presenting you as the occupant of a disputed property, and the documents as his rightful property that you were wrongfully holding. Vale said, exactly, which is why the timing of your filing matters enormously. If we can get an emergency injunction filed before Greer files his own claim with the county court, we establish the legal sequence in our favor. He paused. I can file that injunction. I have the authority from the territorial office, but I need the originals of... He stopped. He looked at the cedar box, empty still on the table. Those are what was taken. Silence. Nora looked at Ethan. He looked at her. She picked up the pen. The originals are gone, she wrote. But are certified copies admissible for an emergency injunction? Vale looked at the question. He thought about it with the specific focus of a man working through a legal problem in real time. In standard proceedings, originals are required. For an emergency injunction, where there is documented evidence of tampering, yes. Copies with sworn witness attestation can be sufficient if the judge agrees the emergency circumstances warrant it. He looked at her. You'd need the witnesses to sign affidavits before a notary stating that the copies are accurate to the originals they personally examined. Tom Hadley has seen the originals she wrote. Ruth has. Dan Marsh has. All three can sign affidavits. Today, Vale said. She looked at Ethan. Today, Ethan said. He was already standing. What followed was the longest afternoon of Nora's life. They rode back down the mountain, all three of them. Vale on his bay horse, Ethan on Hatch, Nora on the mule, and split up in Ridgeline. Vale went to find the county notary, a man named Peters, who Vale said would cooperate because Peters worked for the territorial office, not the county. Ethan went to Tom Hadley. Nora went to Ruth. She got to the church and knocked, and Ruth opened the door and read Nora's face before she read the notepad. How bad, Ruth said. Nora wrote, Greer knows about the inquiry. Vale needs affidavits from you, Tom, and Dan Marsh by end of day. Dan's 2 hours away. Can we get a message to him? Ruth was already moving. My husband has a faster horse than any of us. She called into the back of the church, Elias. The minister appeared a quiet, thin man with kind eyes who looked at his wife the way a person looked at a force of nature they had learned to love and not to second-guess. Ruth said, "Ride to the Marsh place. Tell Dan and Hattie to come to the notary's office by 4 o'clock. Tell him Ethan's land and tell him today." Elias Carlyle asked no questions. He went for his hat. "Good man," Nora wrote and showed it to Ruth. Ruth's expression was fierce and warm at once. 31 years and he has never once told me to calm down. She picked up her locked cabinet key. Let's go. The notary's office smelled like ink and old paper, and the particular mustiness of a room where legal weight was measured daily. Peters was a thin, careful man who looked at the file Vale laid before him and then looked at the assembled group. Vale Ethan, Nora Tom Hadley, Ruth Carlyle, with the expression of someone calculating the risk of the moment and its alternatives. "This is against Webb's authentication," he said. "That's correct," Vale said. "Webb is the county clerk. I work in the same building." "You work for the territorial office, Mr. Peters?" Vale's voice was completely even. "Not for Aldous Webb, and not for Silas Greer." Peters looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the file again. Then he picked up his pen. "All right," he said. "Let's start with Mrs. Carlyle." Ruth sat down across from him and began her statement without preamble, speaking in the direct, factual cadence of a woman who had been preparing this statement in her head for 18 months. Dan Marsh arrived at 3:47. He came in with his hat in his hands and took in the room and said, "Am I too late?" "Right on time," Tom Hadley said. Dan sat down. He signed his affidavit in the same firm hand he used for everything, describing the marker's location, his years as a neighboring landowner, his personal knowledge of the Cross homestead's eastern boundary. By 5 o'clock, all 3 affidavits were signed, notarized, and in Edmund Vale's leather case alongside the case file. Vale looked at the assembled group across Peter's desk. "I'll ride tonight," he said. "I can reach the telegraph office in Pueblo by tomorrow morning and wire the filing to the Denver court. An emergency injunction will halt any county-level claim Greer tries to file until the circuit court can hear the full case in September." "And if Greer tries to move before you reach Pueblo," Ethan said, "then Peters files a notice of contested claim here today, which initiates a hold at the county level." Vale looked at Peters. Peters said, "I can do that. I'll walk it over to the county office myself before 6 o'clock. He said it with the quiet resolution of a man who had been waiting for a reason. Ethan looked at him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Peters said. "I've watched Webb for 2 years and done nothing. This is the least I can do." They filed out into the late afternoon sun, and for a moment, all of them stood on the boardwalk outside the notary's office. Ethan, Tom, Ruth, Dan, Nora. And nobody said anything. Nora understood it. There was nothing to say that was big enough yet. The injunction wasn't filed. Vale wasn't in Pueblo. September was still 6 weeks away. But something had shifted. She felt it, and she could see from the way the others stood that they felt it too. The careful, patient structure Greer had built, the isolation, the slow squeeze, the story, where Ethan Cross was a difficult, unstable man who would eventually exhaust himself, fighting the inevitable. That structure had developed too many cracks to hold its shape. Dan Marsh said, "Ethan, you ought to know. 2 of the other ranchers he pushed off, the McAllister family and the widow Breen, they've been staying with relatives. When they hear what's happening here, they'll want to give statements." Ethan looked at him. "I can get word to them," Dan said. "If you want." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, do that." Dan nodded and went for his horse. Tom said, "I should get back, but Ethan, I want you to know something." He stopped, seemed to search for the words. Tom Hadley was a man who built things, not sentences. "I should have done this 2 years ago, stood up with you sooner. I let the fact that you didn't ask for help become an excuse not to offer it." He put out his hand. I'm sorry for that. Ethan shook it. You're here now. Yes, I am. Tom looked at Nora. Ma'am, whatever brought you up on that mountain with a broken wagon, I'm glad it did. She wrote, So am I. He tipped his hat and went. Ruth embraced Nora briefly, which surprised her. Ruth was not an impulsive woman, and the gesture was quick and firm, and said what it said without requiring commentary. Then Ruth went back toward the church, which left Ethan and Nora on the boardwalk in the angling afternoon sun and Vale tying his saddlebag preparing to ride. Vale paused before mounting. He looked at Nora. May I ask you something? She nodded. The organization of that file, the level of detail, the legal indexing. You've done this kind of work before. She wrote ranch accounts, contract review for a missionary network, a lot of reading. He looked at the answer. When this is resolved, and it will be resolved, I believe that if you ever want work that uses those skills properly, I know people in Denver who would be interested. He said it simply as a fact. I mean that. She stared at him. I'll send word through Ruth when the injunction is confirmed, he said. He mounted. He rode south without ceremony. She stood on the boardwalk and felt the offer settle into her, like something she hadn't had a word for until it arrived. Work. Real work. Work that used what she actually was. Ethan came to stand beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Vale ride away. But she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now, that steady, constant presence that had become over the past days something she couldn't imagine the shape of the day without. She wrote, He's going to make it to Pueblo. I think so too, Ethan said, and if Greer finds out he's coming, he'll find out he has someone in every town. Ethan paused. But Vale's already ahead of him, and Greer doesn't know about the affidavits. He thinks he took everything when he took that box. He's going to realize he was wrong. Yes, Ethan said. And when he does, he's not going to be patient about it anymore. She looked at him. What does he do when he's not patient? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He stops using Dillard, he said finally, and uses who. Ethan looked at her. His face was the flat, careful mask she knew now well enough to read what was underneath it, which was not calm, but something that had decided to wear calm as a discipline. Men who don't leave things as tidy as Dillard does, he said. They rode back up the mountain without speaking much, and the silence was not comfortable this time. It was the silence of two people who understood what was coming, and had said everything that was useful to say about it, and were now just moving through the hours between now and then, with the deliberate focus of people who intended to still be standing when it arrived. They were 3/4 of the way up when Nora heard it. A rifle shot. Distant. Below them toward the valley. One shot. No answer. Ethan reined Hatch to a stop and listened. She stopped the mule beside him. Silence. Could be a hunter, he said. She wrote, Do you believe that he looked at the valley below? His jaw worked once. No, he said. They rode the last stretch faster, and when they came around the final bend, and the cabin was there, solid dark log the corral with the horses standing still, she exhaled. The cabin was as they'd left it. The new lock was intact. Everything was exactly as it had been, except for the note nailed to the door. Ethan dismounted and took it down. He read it in the failing light, and she watched his face, and she did not need to read it herself to understand what it said. She had seen enough of Silas Greer's patience to recognize the moment it ran out. He handed it to her. The handwriting was not Dillard's smooth, deliberate script. It was heavier, less practiced. The handwriting of someone who had been told to write a message and was not accustomed to using words as the primary tool. It said, Last chance. Sign over the eastern parcel by Friday, or we settle it the other way. The woman goes first. 4 days. She folded the note carefully. She put it in her bag next to the case file. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at the mountain, the dark ridge above them, the timber, the places where a man with a rifle could stand and not be seen. His hand was on the door of the cabin, but he wasn't moving. She touched his arm. He looked at her. She wrote slowly and clearly, They want you afraid. Afraid means you sign. Afraid means you lose. He read it. Are you afraid? She watched him. He thought about it, really thought not, performed the thinking. She appreciated that. Yes, he said. She wrote, good. Afraid means you understand what's at stake. It doesn't mean you stop. He looked at her for a long time. You ought to leave, he said. Take the mule. Go through the North Pass tonight. You don't have any stake in this that's worth... She held up her hand. Flat. Stop. She wrote, don't finish that sentence. He stopped. I have a stake, she wrote. I am a witness. My name is on those affidavits. I am already in this, and leaving does not make me safer. It makes me more vulnerable alone on a trail with no one who knows where I am. She paused. And I am not going to leave. He looked at her. She met his eyes and held them, and she hoped he understood, because she could not say it, and the writing would take too long, and some things were faster than words that she was not staying out of stubbornness or inability to leave. She was staying because this was the first time in 4 years that she had been somewhere that felt in some way she could not fully account for, like the right place to be. He understood. She could see it. He didn't thank her. He opened the door. Bar it behind you, he said. I'm going to sit with the horses tonight. She went inside. She barred the door. She sat at the table with the note in front of her, and her mother's Bible beside it, and the lamp burning low, and she thought about Friday 4 days away, and the men who would come up the mountain if Ethan didn't sign, and the fact that Edmund Vale was riding toward a telegraph office with everything they'd built. 4 days. She opened the Bible. She didn't read. She just held it. Outside, Ethan Cross sat in the dark with his horses and his rifle, and whatever a man like him carried inside himself when the night got long and the mountain got quiet, and the thing he'd been fighting finally showed its true face. She kept the lamp burning so he could see the light in the window. It was the only thing she had to offer him at that moment, and she offered it without condition, without asking for anything back, the way he had walked into the dark with his rifle the first night she arrived. The lamp burned. She kept it burning until she heard his boots on the porch just before dawn, and she knew he was still there, and she closed her eyes and finally slept. She woke to the sound of Ethan making coffee, not the cautious, minimal sounds of a man trying not to disturb someone. The normal sounds, the tin pot on the iron stove, the small crack of kindling, the particular rhythm of a man moving through his own kitchen in the early morning. She lay on the cot and listened to it, and understood that he had made a decision sometime in the night. She could hear it in how he moved. Not reckless, not resigned. Decided. She got up and came into the main room. He handed her a cup without turning around. She sat at the table. He sat across from her. Between them, the note from the night before was still folded where she had left it. Neither of them looked at it. He said, I've been thinking about what Greer's men are going to do when they come up here Friday. She opened her notepad. They'll expect you to be alone. Yes. He wrapped both hands around his cup. They'll expect me to have had 3 days to get scared. 3 days to think about signing. He paused. They won't be expecting what we've already done. Vale could have the injunction confirmed by now. Maybe. No way to know until we hear from Ruth. He looked at the window, the early light coming through it. But here's what I keep coming back to. Even if the injunction is filed and confirmed, even if the legal case is solid, a man like Greer doesn't stop because a piece of paper tells him to. He stops when it costs him more to continue than to quit. She wrote, what makes it cost him more? He looked at her. Witnesses. Not just in a courtroom. In the open. People who saw what he did and aren't afraid to say so where everyone can hear. She thought about that. You want to bring people to the cabin, she wrote, before Friday. Not to fight, he said quickly. Tom, the Marshes, maybe others. If Greer's men ride up here and find more than just me standing on this porch, the calculation changes. They're not being paid enough to start something in front of a crowd of Valley people who will all be witnesses. She wrote, it has to be their choice. You can't ask people to stand in front of armed men. I know, he said. I won't ask. I'll tell them what's happening and let them decide. He paused. That's the difference between what Greer does and what I'm trying to do. He uses people. I won't. She looked at him across the table, this quiet, stubborn, careful man who had spent 4 years alone on a mountain because he didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like he was using the people he asked. She thought about the first night, the bear, the lamplight, 2 Bibles on a table. She wrote, "Go to Tom first. He'll know who else to ask." "I'll ride down this morning." He stood. "You should come. Someone should stay with the horses." She paused. "And I want to write out a full account of the threat note, date, exact wording, the handwriting. If anything happens before Friday, that document needs to exist." He looked at her for a moment. "You think of everything." "I think of the things that can be written down," she wrote. "You handle the rest." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The thing that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile but didn't need to perform itself. He went for his hat. He was back by early afternoon, and he had not come alone. Tom Hadley rode behind him. Dan and Hattie Marsh. A man she hadn't met, broad-weathered 50s with an iron-gray mustache, and the bearing of someone who had been somewhere hard and come back from it, who turned out to be Samuel Vickers, one of the ranchers Dillard had pushed off his land 18 months ago, and who had been staying with his daughter in Ridgeline ever since. Behind Vickers came his son, maybe 22, with the same jaw and quieter eyes. And behind all of them, riding a black mare with the posture of a woman who had ridden through worse, Ruth Carlyle. Nora came off the porch steps and looked at all of them. Ruth dismounted and came to her and said without preamble, "Vale's telegram arrived this morning. The injunction was filed at 6 o'clock last evening Denver time. It's confirmed. Greer cannot file any county-level claim on Cross land until the circuit court hearing in September." She reached into her coat and produced a folded paper. "Peters received the notice an hour ago. He's already posted the legal hold at the county office." Nora read the paper twice. She looked up at Ruth. She had no voice to shout with. She had no sound she could make that was large enough for what was in her chest at that moment. So she pressed both hands flat against the paper and closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and let it be real. Ruth put a hand on her arm briefly. "It's not over," she said. "But it's different now." "Greer's going to get this news today," Ethan said from behind Nora. "Probably already has it." "Yes," Ruth said. She turned to face the group assembled in front of the cabin. "Which means Friday either gets called off or it gets worse. We need to be ready for both." Samuel Vickers said, "I'll tell you what Greer does when a legal maneuver goes against him." His voice was the flat, certain voice of a man speaking from direct experience. "He did it to me. He does it to everyone." He looked at Ethan. "He finds the thing you care about most that's outside the law's reach, and he goes after that instead." The group went quiet. Nora wrote and held up the pad. "The horses." Ethan looked at her. "She's right," Vickers said. "Your horses aren't in the injunction. Your cabin isn't in the injunction. The eastern parcel is held. Everything else is still exposed." Ethan said, "Then we move the horses to Dan's place tonight." Dan Marsh said, "Already planning on it. Hattie'll take them." Hattie Marsh said, "I'll take them right now if you want." "Not yet." Ethan looked out at the trail down the slope toward the valley below. "If we move the horses now, and someone sees they know we're spooked, I want them to think we're sitting still." Tom said, "You want to look like you're alone up here until Friday." "Until Thursday night," Ethan said. "Then we move everything, and everyone's in position before dawn Friday." Ruth said, "Define position." "You and Peters and Vickers stay in Ridgeline," Ethan said. "Visible. On record. If Greer's men come up here Friday and something happens, I want people in town who saw them ride out and can testify to the direction they went and when." Ruth nodded. "That I can do. Tom, Dan, I'd like you up here." He looked at them directly. "But I mean what I said. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to be present. There's a difference." Tom said, "Ethan, you've been my neighbor for 12 years. Stop explaining yourself and tell me what time to be here." Something in Ethan's chest moved. She could see it from where she stood. "Before dawn," he said. "Thursday night." Tom nodded. Done. Vickers said, "My boy and I'll come too." Ethan looked at him. Vickers, you don't owe me. Greer took my land, Vickers said. Simply, without drama. If your case goes to Hale in September with all this evidence, and you win it, opens the door for the rest of us to contest what happened to us. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because it's the same fight. He paused. But I'm glad it's you holding the line. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, I'm glad you're standing with me. They spent the afternoon making preparations that looked from a distance like nothing was changing. Nora moved through the cabin and made sure every copy of every document was in a separate location, one set in her bag, one set at Ruth's, one set that Vale had taken to Denver. She wrote a detailed account of the threat note and signed it and had Tom and Dan witness the signature, and that went into Ruth's coat pocket to be added to the notary's file. She also did something she hadn't told Ethan she was going to do. She sat at the table and wrote a complete account. Not a legal document. A narrative, everything from the broken wagon wheel on the lower trail, through the bear, through the 5 days in the cabin, through the ride to Ridgeline and Ruth and Tom, and the empty cedar box, and Edmund Vale, and the notarized affidavits, and the threat note on the door. She wrote it in the plain direct voice her mother had taught her. The voice that said things as they were without ornamentation. She dated it, signed it, and set it on the table. Hattie Marsh, coming in from the kitchen, picked it up and read the first page and set it down and looked at Nora. "This is the whole story," Hattie said. Nora nodded. "You wrote this for after," Hattie said. "In case something goes wrong Friday and someone needs to know what happened." Nora held her gaze. Hattie folded the pages carefully and put them in her apron pocket. "I'll keep this," she said. "Nothing's going to go wrong, but I'll keep it." Thursday night came down fast and cold, the way mountain nights did even in July, and by midnight the horses were at Dan Marsh's place on the East Ridge, and Tom and Dan were in the cabin sleeping in shifts, and Vickers and his son were in the barn with their rifles and their quiet, and the particular patience of men who knew how to wait. Ethan sat on the porch. Nora brought him coffee and sat beside him on the step. They stayed like that for a long time. The valley below was dark, and the stars were extraordinary, and somewhere an owl was working the tree line with its own specific business. He said, "You're not afraid." She shook her head slowly. "Why not?" She thought about it. Then she opened the notepad and wrote by the faint light from the cabin window, "I've been afraid for 4 years. Afraid I would never find a place that needed what I had to offer. Afraid that the silence would just go on and on until it became the only thing I was." She paused. "I'm not afraid now, because whatever happens tomorrow, I know that's not true anymore." He read it. He was quiet for a while. "I've been afraid for 4 years too," he said. "Different reasons." She waited. "Afraid that staying alone was strength," he said. "Afraid that if I let anyone close enough to matter, I'd lose them, and it would be worse than never having them." He looked out at the dark. "I lost my brother. My mother before that. The woman who waited for me, that was my fault, not hers. I was too far inside this mountain and too convinced that what was up here was worth more than what was down there." A long pause. "I was wrong about the last part." She wrote, "Which part?" He looked at her. "I was wrong about what's worth protecting," he said. "Land matters. This land matters. But that's not the whole of it." She held the notepad. She didn't write anything. He didn't say anything else. But he didn't move away from her on the step, and she didn't move away from him, and the night was very large around them, and very quiet, and it was enough. Dawn came hard and gray and fast. Ethan was on the porch before the light had fully settled. Tom and Dan came out of the cabin. Vickers and his son moved from the barn to the corral fence. Ruth had sent word through Dan that she and Peters and Vickers's cousin would be visible on the main street of Ridgeline from 8 o'clock onward, watching. 8 o'clock came. 8:30. 9. Tom said, "Maybe they're not coming." "They're coming," Ethan said. 9:15. She heard them before she saw the dust. The particular rhythm of multiple horses moving at pace, not trying to be quiet, not trying to be polite about their arrival. 6 of them. Coming up the main trail from the south. She recognized Cord Dillard's gray vest at the front. She recognized the 2 men behind him from the encounter on the North Trail. The 3 behind them were new, bigger, harder-faced, the kind of men who were not here for conversation. Dillard brought his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch. He looked at the assembled group, Ethan on the steps, Tom and Dan flanking the door, Vickers and his son at the corral. Nora standing to Ethan's left, and his pleasant expression did not arrive this morning. What arrived instead was a careful recalibration, the expression of a man adjusting his plan in real time. "Ethan," he said, "looks like you've got company." "I do," Ethan said. He didn't move from the step. "Mr. Greer sent us up to get your answer." Dillard's voice was still smooth, still reasonable. "The offer he made you. The threat he made," Ethan said. "Write it down the right way." Dillard's expression tightened a fraction. "Now there's no need to—" "I have the note," Ethan said. "Witnessed and filed with the county notary." He paused. "Along with the injunction filed yesterday in Denver by the Territorial Land Office holding all claims on this property until the September Circuit Court hearing." Dillard went very still. "I don't know what you're—" "Yes, you do." Ethan's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You know about the injunction. You know about the affidavits. You know about Edmund Vale. You rode up here hoping I didn't know you knew, but you do." A long silence. One of the men behind Dillard shifted in his saddle. Tom Hadley said from the doorway, "Morning, boys. Recognize me, Tom Hadley. Ironworks Ridgeline. I've known this land and this man for 12 years. He nodded toward Dan Marsh. "Dan Marsh. East Ridge, 15 years. Samuel Vickers used to have the Vickers parcel south of town before your boss stole it from him." He paused. "We're all witnesses to this conversation, every word." Dillard looked at Tom, then at Dan, then at Vickers, then at Nora. He looked at Nora for a moment that was 2 seconds too long. She held his gaze without blinking. She had her notepad in her hand. She had not opened it. She did not need to write anything. She was a witness, and he knew it, and the knowing was visible on his face like weather. He looked back at Ethan. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't. It ends in September when Judge Hale looks at the evidence and rules on the deed." His voice was flat and clear. "Which is how it should have been handled from the beginning. Instead of broken locks and threat notes and 6 men riding up a mountain on a Friday morning." One of the 3 men at the back said something low, and the man next to him put a hand on his arm. Dillard said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. "Let's go," he said to the men behind him. They turned. They rode back down the trail the way they had come. All 6 of them. The sound of the hooves faded, and the dust settled, and the mountain went quiet. Nobody on the porch moved for a full 30 seconds. Then Tom Hadley exhaled so loudly that it was almost a laugh, and Dan Marsh took his hat off and rubbed his head, and Vickers' son said something under his breath that wasn't quite a word, and Hattie, who had appeared at the cabin door sometime in the last minute because Hattie Marsh appeared wherever she was needed, without anyone seeing her arrive, said, "Well, good." Ethan turned and looked at Nora. She looked back at him. She wanted to write something equal to the moment. She turned the notepad pages looking for one that was blank, and she couldn't find the words that were large enough and simple enough at the same time. She wrote, "6 men just rode back down your mountain." He said, "They did." She wrote, "Your land is still yours." He said, "It is." She looked at him. "You're not alone anymore," she wrote. He held her gaze. His jaw worked once. He looked like a man carrying something very heavy who has just been shown a place to set it down. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." September came. The way seasons came in the high country, not gradually, not apologetically, but decisively, the heat breaking in a single night, and the mornings arriving cool and bright and smelling of something turning, Judge Hale rode into Ridgeline on a Tuesday. He was a compact, meticulous man with 20 years on the circuit, and the particular bearing of someone who had seen every version of human dishonesty and was still somehow not cynical about it. Edmund Vale rode with him. Behind them came a federal marshal who had been dispatched from Denver when Vale's filing described the burglary of evidence. The hearing took 2 days. Ruth Carlyle testified for 4 hours. She did not consult notes. She did not hedge. She presented the letter, the timeline, the 18 months of records she had kept with the methodical patience of a woman who had always known this day was coming. Tom Hadley testified about the survey discrepancy. Dan Marsh testified about the boundary marker. Peters testified about the authentication date and his cousin's letter, which he had finally allowed himself to produce officially, with the quiet look of a man who had been waiting 2 years for permission to do the right thing. Samuel Vickers testified about what had happened to his land. His son sat beside him and did not look away from Greer's lawyer once. Aldous Webb attempted to explain the authentication. He could not. He grew confused under Vale's questioning and contradicted himself twice and looked at Silas Greer from the stand with the expression of a man who has just understood the full cost of the arrangement he made. Greer's lawyer argued that the copies were insufficient, that the originals had been legitimately recovered as Greer's property, that Ethan Cross was an unstable recluse making paranoid accusations against a reputable businessman. Judge Hale listened to all of it. He ruled on the second afternoon. The forged deed was declared legally void. The authentication by Webb was invalidated. The eastern parcel of Ethan's land was confirmed as Cross property under the original 1861 homestead claim. Aldous Webb was referred to federal authorities for investigation of fraud in public office. Silas Greer was ordered to appear before a federal grand jury within 60 days regarding the displaced family's claims. He did not look at anyone when the ruling was read. He sat with his hands on the table and his face composed and his eyes fixed on some middle distance that wasn't the room he was in. And Nora, watching him from across the courtroom, thought he is already calculating what comes next. Men like him always were. But calculating what came next was not the same as winning. Outside the courthouse, the Valley people who had come to hear the ruling stood in the autumn light, and some of them spoke, and some of them did not, and all of them had the particular stillness of people who had just watched something shift, that they had not believed could shift. The McAllister family was there, the widow Breen. 3 other families whose names Nora had written into the case file from Ruth's records, families who had lost things and had not believed they would get them back, and were now standing in front of a federal ruling that said someone had been paying attention. Tom Hadley shook Ethan's hand for a long time and didn't say anything. Dan Marsh clapped him on the shoulder and walked away before anyone could see his face. Samuel Vickers looked at Ethan and said, "Your land." "My land," Ethan said. Vickers nodded once. "Mine next." "Yes?" Ethan said. "Yours next." Edmund Vale found Nora in the crowd. He said, "The offer I made you in Ridgeline, I want you to know it stands. The Territorial Land Office has an opening for a records analyst. It's real work, real pay, and you'd be the best person who's applied for it, whether you know you've applied or not." He handed her a card. "Denver, whenever you're ready." She took the card. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it in her coat pocket next to her mother's Bible. She found Ethan at the edge of the crowd. He was watching the McAllister family. A woman, 2 children, a man with the battered, careful look of someone who had learned to move through the world without expecting it to hold, and his face had the expression she had come to know as the one that meant he was feeling something he didn't have architecture for yet. She stood beside him. He said, "Vale offered you something." She nodded. "Denver." She nodded. He was quiet. She waited. "That's a good opportunity," he said. He said it carefully. The way he said things he meant, but that cost him something to say. She took out the notepad. "It is," she wrote. "I haven't decided." He looked at the words. "What factors into the decision?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about the bear in the dark, and the lamp she kept burning, and the step they had sat on together under the stars, and his voice saying, "I was wrong. about what's worth protecting. She wrote, several. He looked at the word. Then he said, "When you decide whatever you decide, I want you to know something." She waited. "The day you came back down the mountain," he said. "When you'd already made it past the split boulder and turned around. I thought it was for the Bible." He paused. "I knew it wasn't for the Bible." She looked at him. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say," he said. "I'm still not sure I do." He looked at the crowd, the mountains behind the town, the long autumn light going gold across the ridge. "But I know that the cabin doesn't feel like the same place it was before you came to it. And I know I don't want it to go back to being that." She stood very still. She wrote slowly, "The cabin needs a better lock on the back window. I noticed it the first week." He looked at that. The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll fix it," he said. "I know," she wrote. "You fix things." "So do you," he said. "Just different things." She put the notepad away. She took his arm. Not dramatically, not as a statement. Just the simple, direct gesture of a woman who has decided where she is standing and is done moving away from it. He looked down at her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own. They stood like that while the crowd moved around them and the autumn light shifted. And somewhere behind them, Ruth Carlyle was talking to the McAllister family, and Tom Hadley was arguing cheerfully with Dan Marsh about something that had nothing to do with land or law or fraud, and was probably about fencing. And the mountain above the town was green and gold and enormous and patient the way mountains were. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were the quiet, necessary work of people building something real. Ethan writing his eastern boundary every day and writing it in the ledger, not because he had to now, but because the habit had become his own. Nora helping Ruth organize the remaining displaced families' cases into the same structured format that had carried Ethan's case before Judge Hale. Both of them together in the cabin evenings, with the lamp burning and the two Bibles on the table, and the kind of silence between them that was not empty but full, the way good silences were. She did not go to Denver. Not because the offer wasn't real or the work wasn't good. Because she had looked at the card, and looked at the mountains, and looked at the man on the porch, and understood with the quiet clarity that came to her sometimes in the place where words ran out, that the work she needed to do was here. Not forever, perhaps, but now. The circuit court eventually indicted Silas Greer on 4 counts of land fraud. Aldous Webb lost his position and faced federal charges. Preston Cole, the nephew by marriage, cooperated with investigators and testified against them both in exchange for a reduced charge, the way frightened men with limited loyalty always did, when the structure they had trusted finally came apart. 3 of the 6 displaced families had their land claims reviewed, and 2 of them were restored. The widow Breen's case was still moving through the territorial court in the spring, but Vale had told Nora privately that it was going the right direction. Cord Dillard left the county and was not heard from again in that valley, which was the closest thing to justice the law could offer for a man who had done his worst work too quietly to fully prove. On the morning of the first real snowfall, Ethan stood on the porch and watched the white come down through the pines, and Nora stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then he said, "You counted days." She looked at him. "You told me that first night. That you'd counted the days since you lost your voice." He kept watching the snow. "Do you still count?" She thought about it. She shook her head. He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had been hoping was true. She took out the notepad. She wrote the last thing she would write that day before she put the notepad in her pocket, and they went inside where the coffee was hot and the fire was going, and the 2 Bibles sat side by side on the table. They had both sat it so many times now that the wood had the look of something used with intention and care. "I stopped counting the day I stopped leaving," she wrote. He read it. He held the door open for her. She walked inside. And that was how a mute woman with a broken wagon and a mountain cowboy who had forgotten how to need anyone built something together that neither silence nor distance nor the patience of corrupt men could take from them. Not through grand declarations or dramatic rescues, but through the daily, stubborn, ordinary miracle of 2 people who chose to stay.